Welcome to this online lesson on search and destroy tactics in the Vietnam War. Why did US tactics fail? The aims today are to know the nature of US search and destroy tactics, to explain how search and destroy worked, and to evaluate the effectiveness of search and destroy tactics. First of all, have a look at this cover from Life magazine. Life magazine is a popular current affairs magazine in the United States and has a reputation for holding images on its front cover that sum up the mood or the events of the age. This particular edition, which is dated to November the 27th of 1964, not too long after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August, shows US Special Forces burning down a Viet Cong hideout in a village. As a starter activity, how might the US public react to seeing this image? Pause this video and study the image now, coming up with your answer. What did you think? Perhaps the American public would support these soldiers and patriotically think that they're doing the right thing to defeat communism. Equally, they might question why they are burning down this village. Was it really necessary? They might wonder what tactics were being used by the United States. Some might actually turn against the war and think that what they are doing is wrong. The truth is, all of these reactions and more are likely to have happened at the time this image was published. Now we'll have a look at some key terms used within the lesson. This edition of Cloak's Compendium of Annoying Old-Fashioned Words That You Need to Know includes the draft, compulsory recruitment for the armed forces. This works like conscription. To draft something means to draw it out of something. The draft in America worked on a basis of supposedly randomly chosen numbers that would decide which young men would be sent off to fight. Secondly, search and destroy. This was a US and ARVN tactic against the Viet Cong. The aim was to find the Viet Cong and then kill or capture them. Thirdly, defoliant. This is a plant-killing chemical. Consider the prefix de, meaning remove, and the root word foliage, meaning leaves. Also consider herbicide, the suffix side, meaning to kill, and herb, well, a herb is a plant, isn't it? Your tasks. First of all, record the key terms. Secondly, what might be the public reaction to the draft? And thirdly, what might be the dangers of search and destroy as a tactic? Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Done? So, what might be the public reaction to the draft? Think about who might be chosen to fight. It would be predominantly young men. What effect would this have on families? Would people see this as fair? For the challenge task, what might be the dangers of search and destroy as a tactic? Well, a reminder, the Viet Cong blended in with the civilians. How difficult might it be to actually find them? How easy might it be to select the wrong targets and actually do more damage to your reputation as a side fighting in a war rather than helping to defeat the enemy? We'll look at these tasks and more topics as we go through the video. We're going to consider now sending in the troops. First of all, look at the diagram in the top right. This table shows US troop numbers in Vietnam. Consider how they keep going up and up and up all the way through to 1968, by which point there are over 500,000 US soldiers in Vietnam. Quite incredible numbers. Now some more information. The first ground troops in Vietnam were special forces working with ARVN, such as the Green Berets, helping with the Strategic Hamlets program. Then the Air Force asked for troops to protect air bases. 3,500 US Marines were sent in 1965. As Rolling Thunder continued, the number of troops increased too. Johnson used the draft to send enough men. Now, it should be noted that the Rolling Thunder air bases were in Thailand and based on aircraft carriers out in the Gulf of Tonkin. However, in concert with this, there was a big expansion in the South Vietnamese Air Force's efforts to contain the Viet Cong to go along with Operation Rolling Thunder. These aircraft carried South Vietnamese markings, but very often had at least one member of the crew who was a trained pilot from the US Air Force. Your tasks then. Why did Rolling Thunder, an air bombing campaign, result in ground troops being sent to Vietnam? Consider as well the role in protecting air bases. Secondly, study the table. A. Choose a statistic that surprises you. I'm not going to tell you why it might surprise you, that's your own reaction. Explain why that statistic surprises you. B. Use the statistics in the table to explain why the draft was necessary to get enough troops to Vietnam. Review what the draft meant in our section on keywords if you need to. Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Done? Alright, let's move on to another example. Search and destroy. You may want to add this as a subheading if you're making notes. Search and destroy involves small units of US soldiers who search the jungle for Viet Cong camps and supplies. US troops would call in helicopters or planes to bomb or spray chemicals on Viet Cong hideouts. We'll revisit the spraying of chemicals later on. Missions took place on ground with traps laid by the Viet Cong. In a previous video I did on Operation Rolling Thunder compared with the guerrilla tactics used by the Viet Cong, we considered the use of punji traps. These were booby traps, often using sharpened stakes covered with excrement to cause infections, which caused US and ARVN forces to spend more time looking at the ground and where their feet were treading than looking for the enemy, a very effective tactic. Finally, there were very few full-scale battles. These usually involved very brief hit-and-run ambushes, deadly in their own right, but it was rare for there to be large numbers of soldiers facing up against each other. Here are some tasks. First of all, use a sentence or two to describe the search and destroy tactic. Secondly, give an example that reflects the guerrilla warfare of the Viet Cong. Again, revisit my video on Rolling Thunder versus the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong if you need to. Thirdly, as a challenge, explain why these tactics might not have worked. Pause the video now, and when you're ready, move on. Ready to move on? Well, let's briefly consider the challenge here. Why might these tactics not have worked? Well, remember the advantages that the Viet Cong had. They usually had the support of the local people who would try and help the Viet Cong cover their tracks. Also remember the tactic of using tunnels. This is related to the photograph you can see on this slide. Here, one of the US soldiers is being lowered down into a hole. This hole is actually the entrance to a network of Viet Cong tunnels. Specially trained soldiers armed with flashlights or torches and pistols and knives would head down into these pitch dark caverns in order to search out Viet Cong operatives. These so-called tunnel rats must have had one of the most dangerous and unpleasant jobs of the war. Moving on. Why didn't search and destroy work? This diagram will help explain why the search and destroy tactic was unsuccessful and sometimes did more harm than good to the USA's interests in Vietnam. This is how a search and destroy operation might work. The first wave of the search and destroy operation missions were launched by the US and ARVN soldiers. US soldiers might kill 1,100 Viet Cong fighters. Then the US soldiers destroy the Viet Cong hideouts. And then they would report that only 100 US troops had been killed. This could be declared as a victory, and generals like Westmoreland very often did this. Then, once the US troops leave, the Viet Cong go back into the area that supposedly had just been cleared. Ordinary villagers, often harmed, which made support for the US and the South Vietnamese government even worse than it had been before. The villagers often became refugees as a result of the destruction of these raids or being deliberately displaced by American forces. This means that the USA was actually no closer to winning. Not only that, villagers who might have been harmed by these operations might consider joining the Viet Cong later, meaning that it was actually a very useful recruiting tool for the Viet Cong. Your tasks then. Firstly, you might want to make your own copy of this diagram if you think it will help your notes. Then, describe why US commanders like Westmoreland thought search and destroy worked. Secondly, give 2 to 3 reasons why search and destroy didn't work. And thirdly, use a point example explain paragraph to explain why search and destroy was an unsuccessful tactic. Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Done? Well, let's consider a couple of the answers. Why might US commanders like Westmoreland think that this works? Well, in conventional warfare, in places like Korea, for example, but particularly in the Second World War, US generals, who had usually been trained in these earlier conflicts, considered victories based upon the body count of their enemies. It stood to reason that if you killed more of the enemy than you lost yourself, then you would eventually win. However, this process cannot really be applied to the Vietnam War. Remember, the Viet Cong was constantly recruiting, and there were only a very few of them. So even if you could argue that you killed more Viet Cong fighters than the US and ARVN forces lost themselves, you couldn't just declare victory in that sense. New Viet Cong soldiers were always joining up. Secondly, in terms of the reasons why search and destroy didn't work, well, consider what happens next. Were Viet Cong soldiers really cleared from these areas? If they were, usually only temporarily. Did this win over the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese villagers? Well, no, very often the opposite happened. And lastly, why was the USA no closer to winning? Well, once you'd cleared one area, as soon as the Viet Cong moved back in, you had to go and do it again. And that would only complete this vicious cycle of upsetting the villagers and making them join the Viet Cong themselves. We'll move on to another section now. Here's a case study of a particular search and destroy operation, in this case quite an important and large one. Consider the diagram in the bottom right. This triangle, this is a part of the Iron Triangle, which is north of Saigon in South Vietnam, was the area in which Operation Cedar Falls was expected to take place. American forces wanted to clear an area between the villages of Ben Suc and important river and road crossings in the region. They were going to use typical search and destroy tactics in order to do this, so let's see what they actually achieved. This operation, carried out in the Iron Triangle north of Saigon, where the Viet Cong were at their strongest, shows why search and destroy failed. 30,000 US and ARVN troops were deployed, supported by helicopters. The operation started in Ben Suc, pictured in the map, where villagers were flown out to refugee camps. In the picture on the top right, we can see an American Chinook heavy-lift helicopter preparing to lift out villagers and some of their meagre belongings. This would not have been popular with these villagers, who after all would rather that the war had stayed away from their areas, and often they supported the Viet Cong because they saw the corruption of the South Vietnam government as not serving their interests. Then the troops burned down the village. Then the process was repeated all across the Iron Triangle for 3 weeks. The idea was that if you moved the civilians out, they wouldn't be harmed, and if you burnt down their villages, those villages could no longer support the Viet Cong. Your tasks then. First of all, write a brief summary of the operation under the headings what, so what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, who was involved, why did they use these tactics, and finally, how the operation was conducted. Secondly, what was the likely reaction of the villagers? Also, what was the likely reaction of the Viet Cong to these tactics? Thirdly, and as an extension, why was this plan likely to fail? Pause the video now and complete the activities. When you're done, press play and we'll continue. Ready to move on? Alright, well let's consider the outcomes of Operation Cedar Falls. These were the results. 750 Viet Cong were killed, 450 US and ARVN were killed and wounded. Thousands of refugees, 3,500 from Ben Suc alone, were moved away from their homes. This led to the whole of the Iron Triangle being declared a free fire zone, which could be bombed without warning. The idea was that once the villagers had been moved out, it was known and spread around that the entire area was subject to be bombed at any time and without warning. This meant that any villagers who moved back, especially if they moved back early, might well be caught up in American and ARVN bombing raids. Consequently, many villagers moved back into the Iron Triangle. They were unable to read the warning leaflets dropped on them, and so they ended up being caught in the bombing. So, the villagers lost faith in the US and South Vietnamese governments. Write a narrative account analysing why Cedar Falls failed to defeat the VC. 8 marks. Remember to use the connectives as shown on this slide. Now this is a task that in the Edexcel GCSE exam will be found especially in paper 2. My students would be studying the American West. However, it's quite a useful activity for seeing how cause and effect can happen in the Vietnam War as well. So this bit of exam practice will be good for consolidating of your knowledge on the Vietnam War, even though you won't be asked a question exactly like this in the exam. Remember, narrative accounts should be told in chronological order. So what's one of the first things to happen? What does that then lead to? What's the consequence of that? And what's the final result? You'll want to spend about 10 to 15 minutes completing this question in around 3 paragraphs. You may begin. Pause the video now. Right, once you're done, we'll have a look at an example answer. Here's an example answer to the narrative account question. Operation Cedar Falls did achieve, there's a typo there, even teachers make those sometimes, I'll cross that out one day. Operation Cedar Falls did achieve some success in killing VC fighters, as 750 were counted dead. This led to, notice I've underlined that as it's a connecting phrase, this led to the US declaring the Battle of Victory, as the American commanders judged victory by how many enemies had been killed. Another connecting phrase underlined here. This in turn led to the region in the Iron Triangle being declared a free fire zone, as the Americans believed that anyone left in it would be Viet Cong and therefore could be bombed at will. However, after Cedar Falls, many villagers moved back. Consequently, they were in danger from American and ARVN air and artillery attacks, and the warnings that were given to them were not heeded as the illiterate villagers couldn't read the leaflets. Overall, Cedar Falls failed as the evacuated villagers lost faith in the US and South Vietnamese forces, and the Viet Cong were not permanently weakened by these attacks. VC guerrilla tactics meant that once the US and ARVN forces moved on, they reoccupied the Iron Triangle. Compare this to your answer. Are there any improvements that you could make? Are there any improvements you could make to my answer? If so, you could always drop me a message in the comments. Let's move on. Now we're going to have a look at a side factor about the search and destroy tactics that is very unpleasant and very controversial. You may want to make a subheading now, Operation Ranch Hand. This is an example of chemical warfare, not one that was intended to directly harm people, but one that ended up harming them nonetheless. Spraying the jungle with defoliants started during Kennedy's presidency in 1961, but later expanded between 1964 and 1970 under the leadership of President Johnson and later President Nixon. Herbicides were 50% stronger than those used on US farms, so these were seriously dangerous chemicals. One of the chemicals was known as Agent Blue. This killed food crops very fast. Then there was Agent Orange. This is a stronger chemical that was used to clear jungle. 3,000 villages were sprayed, which represents 24% of Vietnam. Villagers rarely escaped before the spraying commenced. I should point out that Agent Blue and Agent Orange were named after the colour of the labels on the barrels as they were delivered to South Vietnam. Your tasks then. First of all, explain the impact that an Agent Blue spraying campaign might have had on A, villagers, but also on B, the Viet Cong. Consider the purpose of Agent Blue. Secondly, why would Agent Orange be useful in fighting the Viet Cong? Thirdly, chemical weapons are banned in warfare. How did the USA get away with the chemical warfare of Operation Ranch Hand? Remember what the intended victims of these chemicals were. It wasn't people, was it? Pause the video now and answer the questions. Are we done? Right, let's consider task number 1. The effect on villagers, first of all, would be to destroy their livelihoods. Many of these farming villages relied entirely on agriculture for their income, so by killing the crops, they were actually killing their businesses. Secondly, the effect on the Viet Cong was any rice or other foods that could have been supplied to them would have been destroyed, leading them to have a weaker supply network within the villages. Secondly, why would Agent Orange be so useful in fighting the Viet Cong? Well, remember, one of their key tactics was hiding in the jungle, where they could not be seen from the air. By destroying the jungle itself, it made Viet Cong movements and encampments that much more visible from the air and that much more open to attack. Lastly, chemical weapons are banned in warfare. We've seen this in recent news events such as the war in Syria. However, there is something of a loophole here. The chemicals sprayed as part of Operation Ranch Hand were only intended to harm the plants that they were being sprayed on. They were not intended to directly harm the people. So this is something of a loophole. What turned out to happen, though, is some pretty dire consequences for the local people. Let's consider the legacy of Agent Orange. By 1970, there was clear proof that Agent Orange was causing health defects. Poisons in the chemicals didn't dissolve in water, so they could be carried for miles in drinking water. Many Vietnamese villagers got their water from the rivers, so if an Agent Orange attack happened upstream, then the poisons would be carried downstream and the villagers would be taking on poisons completely unaware of what they were ingesting. Secondly, the poison stayed in the soil. This has affected the crops for years. If an Agent Blue or Agent Orange attack affected 1 year's crops, then those crops would also be affected for years to come. This caused economic hardship for these Vietnamese farmers, but also could result in famine and food shortages. Thirdly, and perhaps most unpleasantly, were the health effects that lasted for decades and included skin, heart, bone and lung diseases. They also caused cancer among the civilian population and perhaps most shockingly, birth defects. The birth defects were babies who were born to mothers who had been ingesting Agent Orange, often had developmental defects and abnormalities. I'm about to show an image of some of these birth defects. It's pretty unpleasant. I think it's important for us to face up to the history, which is often very unpleasant, but if you'd prefer to look away, then do so by skipping on a moment now. Here we see an image taken in the 1970s of children who were born to mothers who had ingested Agent Orange. You notice that their bones are deformed, they have eye defects, and many of them had learning and mental abnormalities as well. These shocking images were horrible for people to see around the world and did much to turn people against the Americans' role in Vietnam, and has made Agent Orange and Operation Ranch Hand one of the most notorious aspects of the Vietnam War. A very, very tragic consequence of this conflict, and one that should not be forgotten. So the American public was horrified. In 1971, chemical spraying stopped, partially as a result of international condemnation of the effects of Agent Orange. Your tasks are to describe the effects of Agent Orange. Why did the government respond with so much public shock? Bearing in mind that very often the government was slow to respond to public shock about the war. Thirdly, what aspect or aspects of Ranch Hand do you think would have most shocked people? Explain your points of view, but there is no wrong answer to this. Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Okay, I think it's time we moved on from that. Finally, note down a fact for each of the following. How did search and destroy operate? Why didn't search and destroy work? How did Cedar Falls affect civilians? And why did the American public object to Agent Orange? Pause the video and note down some quick examples to this. Don't spend any longer than 5 minutes on it. Done? Well, let's consider what you might have put down. How did search and destroy operate? Well, remember, the Americans and ARVN would go into areas, clear out the civilians, burn down their villages, and try and find any Viet Cong that they could and kill them in combat. Why didn't search and destroy work? Well, for one thing, it harmed civilians, and this turned them against the South Vietnamese and the American armies. Not only that, once an area had been cleared, the Viet Cong would usually move back in, at least as strong as they had been before. How did Cedar Falls affect civilians? Well, in this particular case, remember the villages were evacuated and their villages were burnt down as well. Take the example of Ben Suk, which is pictured there. The civilians were lifted out, their village was then burnt down, and when they moved back in, it was a free fire zone where they could be bombed at will. And why did the American public object to Agent Orange? Well, much of that credit must go to the shocking and very distressing images of the children with birth defects, which could be seen from press releases from the Vietnam War. This would put pressure on the US government to change their tactics and to stop using chemicals like Agent Orange. Well, on that note, we'll finish the lesson there. I hope that's been helpful to you. If you are wanting to do more revision and more content on these topics, then please like this video and subscribe to my channel where new videos are being uploaded all the time. Thanks very much and goodbye.